The year was 1305, and London streets echoed with the daily hum of city life. The clatter of horse hooves on cobblestone, the shouts of vendors peddling their wares, and the murmurs of passers-by going about their business. On this particular August morning, however, there was a sense of something different, something ominous hanging in the air. The vendors' cries soon became drowned out by a new sound, the restless murmurs of a bloodthirsty crowd gathering in anticipation. The event that drew them here was not an ordinary spectacle. It was an execution, but one that would become infamous in the annals of history. The man who was to face the hangman's noose that day was none other than William Wallace, the Scottish knight who had dared to defy the might of the English crown. The very name Wallace had become a symbol of rebellion, and now the English king, Edward I, known as Longshanks, had decreed that this symbol must be extinguished. But what was about to unfold in front of the London crowd was not just the death of a man. It was a carefully orchestrated act of cruelty, designed not only to kill, but to break the spirit of a nation. While Hollywood has often portrayed Wallace's final moments as a heroic death, a quick, noble end for a brave man, the truth was far darker. Edward I's execution of Wallace was not about a swift end to a brave resistance fighter. No, this was meant to be a spectacle of suffering, a public reminder of English power. This was a death that would haunt Scotland for generations to come, one so brutal that it would forever be etched into the collective memory of the people. As the crowds began to swell around the execution site, London transformed from a city of everyday life to one of morbid curiosity and political theater. The symbolism of this moment was not lost on those who had gathered. For the English, this was about sending a message that defiance would not be tolerated, and anyone who dared to challenge the English crown would face consequences so horrific they would be etched into history itself. Wallace had once been an unlikely hero, a man of humble origins, driven to arms not for power or prestige, but by a personal tragedy. His family, like so many Scots, had been crushed under the heel of English occupation, and it was this personal loss that had propelled him to the front lines of the Scottish War of Independence. But now, as he faced his final hours, he was not just a man. He was a symbol of resistance against the English, and a symbol that Edward I sought to destroy. The air was thick with anticipation as the crowds waited. The calm of the morning would soon give way to the brutal reality of a public execution that would not only end a life, but attempt to erase the very spirit that had once inspired it. William Wallace was not born into nobility, nor did he seek the riches and power of kings. His rise to prominence was driven by a deeply personal loss, a loss that would shape not only his destiny, but also the fate of an entire nation. His family, along with many other Scots, had suffered under English occupation. His father, a minor landowner, had been killed in an English raid, leaving Wallace to inherit his father's land and a thirst for vengeance. But it wasn't just revenge that drove him. It was a profound sense of injustice. Wallace saw firsthand the brutality of English rule, the way the people of Scotland were oppressed and crushed under Edward I's reign. As a young man, he became disillusioned with the idea that Scots should live under the thumb of their English overlords. Wallace's call to arms was not born from a desire for personal gain, but from a deep-seated belief that Scotland deserved to be free, to stand on its own as a sovereign nation. In 1297, Wallace's first major military victory came at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, where he, along with Andrew Murray, led a group of Scottish forces against the English. The battle was more than just a tactical success. It was a symbol of what Scotland could become. Wallace's forces, though outnumbered, managed to decisively defeat the English, proving that they were not invincible. This victory gave the Scots hope and reignited their desire for independence, with Wallace at the forefront of the movement. Wallace's success at Stirling Bridge was not just about military strategy. It was a demonstration of the unity and strength that could arise from the Scottish people's desire to free themselves from English rule. His victory showed that the might of Edward I's army, long considered unbeatable, could be challenged. Wallace, a simple man with a fierce sense of justice, had transformed from a minor landowner into a symbol of resistance. Yet despite this victory, Edward I was not a king who tolerated defiance. Known for his brutal suppression of the Welsh and his expulsion of the Jews from England, Longshanks viewed Wallace's rebellion as a direct threat to his control over Scotland. He could not allow such an act of defiance to stand without retribution. The more Wallace succeeded, the more dangerous he became to Edward's reign. The king's response would be swift, ruthless, and designed not just to defeat Wallace, but to make an example of him, a warning to anyone who dared challenge English authority. Wallace's fight for Scottish independence was not just about one man's will to survive. It became the embodiment of a nation's struggle for freedom. As he gained more followers and victories, the English king grew more desperate to crush him. But Wallace's resistance was not just a rebellion against a foreign king. It was a movement that challenged the very idea of Scottish subjugation, making him a hero in the eyes of his people. Edward I, known as Longshanks, was a king who ruled with an iron fist. His desire to control the British Isles, particularly Scotland, was absolute. Edward saw Scotland not as a sovereign nation, but as a rebellious province, one that needed to be brought under control by any means necessary. His reign was marked by brutality, a ruthless pursuit of dominance, and a belief that all subjects, regardless of their origins, should answer to the English crown. For Edward, Scotland's resistance was an affront to his authority. The Scottish nobles had been forced into submission over the years, many seeing accommodation with English rule as preferable to the annihilation that defiance could bring. However, Wallace's actions, his defiance, his victory at Stirling Bridge, represented something that Edward could not ignore. Wallace was no mere nuisance. He was a beacon of resistance, a symbol that the English crown's control over Scotland was not as unshakable as Edward wanted it to be. Edward's hatred for rebellion was not just a personal trait, but a core aspect of his rule. He had already earned a reputation for his cruelty toward the Welsh, whom he had subjugated with brutal force, and the expulsion of the Jews from England had cemented his image as a ruler willing to go to extreme lengths to achieve his goals. Wallace's success on the battlefield had to be reversed, not just for military reasons, but to send a message that defiance against the English crown would not be tolerated. The English king knew that rebellion, if left unchecked, could spread like wildfire. Wallace's ability to unite the Scots under a banner of resistance posed a real threat to Edward's plans for complete domination of the Isles. His victories had not only struck fear into the English, but had given the Scots a glimpse of what they could achieve, something Edward could not allow. Wallace's growing fame and influence, especially after his victory at Stirling Bridge, painted him as more than a mere rebel. He had become a symbol of defiance, a figure whose power could inspire others to rise up against English authority. Edward was not merely interested in capturing Wallace to end his rebellion. No, for the king, this was a matter of making an example of him, to show that defying English rule would lead to consequences so severe, so public, that no one in Scotland would ever consider challenging the crown again. Edward's reputation as a conqueror had to be upheld, and the only way to do that was through ruthless punishment, a punishment that would break the spirit of the Scottish people and ensure that the lessons of Wallace's execution would echo through the ages. As Wallace's resistance grew, so did Edward's obsession with him. This wasn't just a manhunt for a rebel. It was a calculated campaign to extinguish a symbol. Edward's desire to capture Wallace and eliminate him was no longer about a military victory. It had become a personal vendetta, one that would end in one of the most brutal executions in history. The hunt for William Wallace was relentless. After his victory at Stirling Bridge, Wallace became a figure of legend, his name whispered in the halls of power and on the lips of common folk alike. But such notoriety made him a target, and the English king, Edward I, spared no effort in ensuring that Wallace would not escape the consequences of his defiance. Edward's forces launched an extensive campaign to track Wallace down, employing spies, informants, and collaborators throughout Scotland. The net was tightening, but Wallace, ever the elusive figure, seemed to slip through the grasp of the English. His capture, however, would not come through a military confrontation or a great betrayal by an enemy on the battlefield. Instead, it came from within the very ranks of his own people. The betrayal of Wallace was a bitter one, as it often is in such stories. Sir John Menteith, a Scottish knight who had submitted to Edward's rule, turned on Wallace and played a central role in his capture. The exact circumstances of Wallace's betrayal remain shrouded in uncertainty. Was it out of fear, greed, or perhaps a twisted sense of survival in a world where aligning with the English seemed to offer protection? The reasons, however, mattered little. The result was the same. Wallace, once the untouchable symbol of Scottish resistance, was now in the hands of the enemy. The moment of Wallace's capture marked the end of his time as a free man and the beginning of his journey into the heart of England. It was not just the physical capture that broke him, but the realization that even his countrymen, those he had fought for, were turning against him. His once mighty rebellion was unraveling, not just because of military defeat, but because of the collapse of his support network. Wallace, who had once united Scotland in defiance of English rule, now found himself isolated. News of his capture spread quickly across England. To Edward, it was a major victory, a symbol that his rule was finally unchallenged. But for Wallace, the real suffering had only just begun. The journey from Scotland to London was itself a form of torture, a psychological game designed to degrade Wallace's spirit before the physical suffering would begin. As he was paraded through towns and villages, he was treated as less than human. The crowds gathered not to cheer his victories, but to gawk at the once great warrior who had been brought low. Wallace's capture was more than just a military defeat. It was a public spectacle. His life was now in the hands of the English authorities, and they intended to use him as a warning. The purpose of his humiliation was not just retribution for his actions, but the creation of a symbol that would deter any future rebellion. This was psychological warfare, calculated and cruel. Wallace had become more than a man. He was a message, a lesson to be learned by all who might consider following in his footsteps. As Wallace's captors made their way through England, the atmosphere became one of both fear and fascination. This was no longer just a prisoner's journey. It was the beginning of a brutal show, one that would end with Wallace's life. But it would also ignite the flame of martyrdom, ensuring his place in history for all time. By the time William Wallace was brought to London in the summer of 1305, he had already endured weeks of humiliation, bound in chains and paraded through the streets like a trophy of conquest. But the greatest mockery was yet to come. Wallace's trial, held at Westminster Hall on August 23, 1305, would be nothing more than a spectacle, a charade designed to legitimize the cruelty that was soon to follow. The trial, like the rest of Wallace's capture and eventual death, was designed not for justice but for propaganda. The English king, Edward I, knew that Wallace's defiance had already become a symbol to the Scots, and he understood the power of the narrative surrounding him. Edward needed to dismantle that symbol, to break it down in the eyes of his people and the world. What better way to do so than with a public trial, where the defiance of the Scots should be obliterated in the court of law? The proceedings were a mockery of legal principles. Wallace, who had never acknowledged Edward as his king, was charged with treason against a sovereign he never recognized. The trial was conducted in Latin, a language Wallace did not understand. To add insult to injury, Wallace was given no real opportunity to defend himself in any meaningful way. His words, even when spoken, were ignored in favor of a foregone conclusion. Edward's will would be carried out, and Wallace would be found guilty. The trial was a performance, a carefully orchestrated farce to justify the punishment that had already been determined. When given the opportunity to speak, Wallace's response was as defiant as it was logical. He declared that he could not be guilty of treason against Edward I because he had never been Edward's subject. In other words, Wallace refused to accept that he owed allegiance to the English crown, and thus he rejected the very charges brought against him. But that defiance was no defense. It was only a death sentence. Edward's men, fully aware of the political ramifications of allowing such a powerful symbol to live, had no intention of granting him any mercy. The trial was a stage set for a predetermined conclusion. Edward had already determined Wallace's fate, and the trial's purpose was not to examine evidence or deliver a fair judgment, but to serve as a formal prelude to the most horrific form of execution imaginable. It was, in essence, an opportunity for the English king to validate the cruelty that was soon to unfold. The charges against Wallace were not just based on his rebellion. They were designed to paint him as a criminal. Treason was the most serious offense one could commit, and it carried with it the ultimate punishment: hanging, drawing, and quartering. The added charges of murder and sacrilege, referring to Wallace's attacks on English soldiers and clergy, painted him as not just a military leader, but as a dangerous criminal who had violated the sanctity of English authority. By portraying Wallace as both a traitor and a criminal, Edward I sought to justify the brutality that would follow. The trial concluded as it had begun, with no real sense of justice, only the grim certainty that Wallace's death was not a matter of if, but when. The trial had offered Wallace no chance for redemption, no opportunity to save himself, and no avenue for escape. It had been a tool of the English crown, a way to craft a narrative, a way to legitimize the horror of what was to come. The verdict was a formality, but the sentence was designed to send shock waves throughout the entire kingdom. Wallace was found guilty of treason, and the punishment for such a crime was as brutal as it was public. Edward I, determined to make an example of the Scottish hero, ordered that Wallace be executed in the most horrific way possible through hanging, drawing, and quartering. This punishment was reserved for the most notorious criminals and traitors, a ritualistic method of execution designed not just to kill, but to utterly dehumanize the condemned. The procedure itself was as gruesome as it was symbolic. Hanging, drawing, and quartering was not a quick death, nor was it intended to be. It was a slow, agonizing process, each part of which carried its own specific purpose in the psychological warfare waged by the English king. The very name of the punishment described the stages of Wallace's destruction: hanging by the neck until nearly dead, drawing the body through the streets in disgrace, disemboweling while still alive, and finally the quartering of the body, cutting it into 4 pieces to be displayed as a warning to others. For Edward, this wasn't simply about executing a man. It was about sending a message. The death of Wallace had to be so horrific, so public, and so thoroughly documented that it would leave no room for doubt in the minds of the Scottish people. It would not just mark the end of Wallace's life, it would obliterate the very symbol he had become. His death, designed to be as humiliating as possible, would send a clear message. Resistance against English rule would be met with annihilation. The English king's plan was calculated to have both immediate and long-term effects. Edward understood that the punishment itself would serve as a deterrent, but he also knew that the memory of Wallace's execution would be carried in the hearts of the Scots for generations. By stripping Wallace of his dignity in the most extreme way, he hoped to prevent any future rebellions and to quash the spirit of resistance that had fueled Scotland's struggle for independence. The brutality of Wallace's punishment was not limited to its physicality. The public nature of the execution was a crucial element in the spectacle. The streets of London, once filled with the bustle of everyday life, were transformed into a theater of death. Crowds gathered to watch as Wallace was led through the streets, bound and degraded, his body dragged behind horses, leaving a trail of blood in his wake. This was not a private matter. It was a public event designed to be witnessed by as many people as possible. As the procession made its way through London, the crowd's reactions were mixed. Some cheered, eager to see the defeat of the man who had become a symbol of resistance. Others, perhaps less enthusiastic, watched in silence. But what mattered most to Edward was the sheer number of people who would witness Wallace's suffering. This was no longer about one man. It was about a message that would resonate throughout the land, a spectacle of power that would burn itself into the collective memory. The sentence had been pronounced, and now the execution itself was about to unfold. What awaited Wallace was a fate so horrific that it would transform him from a warrior into a martyr, from a rebel into a symbol of resistance that would endure far beyond his death. Edward's intention was clear: to destroy Wallace's legacy, to break the will of Scotland, and to remind the people of England's absolute dominance. The morning of August 23, 1305, was bright, yet the atmosphere in London was thick with anticipation and malice. The city had been preparing for days for the arrival of William Wallace. And now, as he was dragged through the streets, bound and humiliated, it became apparent that this execution was not merely a death. It was a spectacle, an event meant to leave an indelible mark on the minds of all who witnessed it. The English authorities had gone to great lengths to ensure that Wallace's suffering would be as public, prolonged, and excruciating as possible. Bound to a wooden hurdle, Wallace was dragged through the streets of London by horses, the cobblestones beneath him scraping and tearing at his flesh. The humiliation began immediately as he was paraded in front of a jeering, bloodthirsty crowd. The crowds were not only a reminder of the English people's apparent triumph over the Scots, but also an audience for the brutality that was about to unfold. The spectacle was designed to degrade Wallace, to strip him of any dignity left, and to turn him from a revered leader into a mere object of ridicule and horror. As he was pulled through the streets, the procession made sure to pass through the busiest parts of London. The English authorities knew exactly what they were doing. The route was chosen for its strategic value, passing through areas where the most people could see Wallace's misery. This was not about an execution. It was about making Wallace's suffering visible, about showing the people that defying the crown would not only cost you your life, but your honor, your dignity, and your very humanity. The public response was mixed, as it often is in such spectacles. Some of the crowd cheered, basking in the misery of the man who had dared to challenge their king. Others, more sympathetic to Wallace's cause, stood in silence, perhaps unwilling to show their true emotions in the presence of such a cruel display. Regardless, the scene was a grotesque carnival, with vendors selling food and drink to the throngs who had gathered to witness the gruesome procession. The cruelty was in the details. As Wallace was dragged through the streets, his blood began to stain the cobblestones, marking the path of a man who had once been a hero, now reduced to a pitiful figure. The crowd threw refuse and taunts at him as he passed, encouraged by the authorities, who sought to ensure that his final moments were as degrading as possible. The streets of London, once a place of life and commerce, had become a stage for the state's brutal display of power. Contemporary accounts describe Wallace as remarkably calm during this ordeal. His eyes, though exhausted, were fixed on some distant point, as if seeing beyond the immediate horror of his situation. Whether this was defiance, resignation, or sheer shock remains unclear, but what was evident was that Wallace did not cry out, did not beg for mercy. His silence in the face of such brutality would become one of the most enduring aspects of his legend. Wallace was not just suffering in body, he was withstanding the public humiliation with a stoic composure that would later be portrayed as the ultimate act of defiance. For the English authorities, this was the beginning of the end. Wallace's journey through London was not just a physical route to the execution ground. It was part of the theater of cruelty that they had meticulously orchestrated. Every moment of his degradation was captured in the eyes of the public, reinforcing the English king's power and setting the stage for the final act of Wallace's destruction. The journey culminated at Smithfield, London's traditional execution ground. As Wallace was dragged to the scaffold, the scene grew more grotesque. The atmosphere was nothing short of a carnival. Vendors continued to hawk their wares, selling pies and ale, while the crowd eagerly awaited the next stage of Wallace's suffering. There was no solemnity in the air, no sense of mourning or justice, only a perverse sense of celebration. The authorities had worked meticulously to create an event that would not be forgotten. They had transformed Wallace's death from a simple execution into a public holiday, a grotesque form of entertainment meant to serve as a stark reminder of English power. The scene at Smithfield was designed to be as humiliating as possible, with the crowd viewing Wallace not as a martyr, but as an object of derision and cruelty. The English king wanted them to see Wallace's final moments as a victory, not just of the state over the individual, but of the English crown over Scotland's defiance. The scaffold at Smithfield had been set up specifically for Wallace's execution, towering above the spectators, ensuring that every twist of his suffering would be witnessed by as many people as possible. Crowds had gathered hours earlier to secure the best vantage points, eager to witness the brutal spectacle. The crowd, growing ever larger, seemed almost giddy with anticipation, as though they were not watching the end of a man's life, but the end of an era. The mighty Wallace, once the symbol of Scottish resistance, was now being brought low, and the English were there to relish every moment. Wallace was forced onto the scaffold, stripped of his clothes and bound to the executioner's frame. His body, exhausted from the journey and the ordeal thus far, was now at the mercy of a professional executioner who had likely carried out dozens of similar acts. This would not be a quick death. The executioner's first task was to hang Wallace by the neck, but not in a way that would lead to a swift death. The noose was placed deliberately to ensure that Wallace would strangle, the life slowly choking out of him. The crowd watched in eerie silence as Wallace's body twitched and convulsed. The pain of strangulation set in, but it was not the end. His face turned purple, his breath growing more ragged as he struggled for air. His body danced the universal dance of death, yet he remained silent. His stoic silence in the face of such torment only added to the legend of the man who had fought so fiercely for his country. The longer he suffered, the more intense the crowd's fascination became. But just as Wallace's body was about to give way to the final release of death, the executioner's skill ensured that he would remain alive. At the precise moment when it seemed Wallace's struggle was over, he was cut down from the gallows, still alive, still conscious. For Edward I, the message was clear. Wallace's punishment would not be a merciful death. It would be a protracted, agonizing end, designed not just to end his life, but to destroy his spirit. The executioner now turned to the next part of the punishment, the disembowelment. While Wallace was still alive, the executioner used a sharp knife to cut open his abdomen, removing his entrails one by one. Contemporary accounts of the scene describe the horrific screams that emerged from Wallace during this ordeal. They were not mere cries of pain. They were described as a sound unlike anything the witnesses had ever heard, a raw, primal expression of suffering that seemed to come from the very depths of human anguish. Each organ removed was held up for the crowd to see, adding to the spectacle. The executioner then threw each piece into the fire that had been prepared for this purpose, the smell of burning flesh and organs filling the air. The medieval mindset at the time saw the bowels as the seat of human emotion and compassion. By burning Wallace's organs, the executioner was symbolically destroying the very humanity of the man in front of the crowd. It was as if, in the eyes of the English authorities, Wallace's defiance had corrupted him to the core, and now they were purging his physical form of any remnants of human dignity. Throughout this entire ordeal, Wallace remained conscious, his eyes open and aware. Even as his body was systematically destroyed, he did not beg for mercy, nor did he cry out for the end to come. Whether his silence was a final act of defiance or simply the result of sheer physical exhaustion, it added to the growing legend of Wallace. His courage, even in the face of such unimaginable suffering, became the heart of his martyrdom. The executioner's skill in prolonging Wallace's suffering was evident. The aim was clear. Death would not be a release. It would come only after the maximum amount of agony had been inflicted. But Wallace, despite the horrors that were being wrought upon his body, did not yield. The crowds watched, mesmerized by his endurance, by the sheer force of his will to remain silent, to endure the unendurable. The execution was not merely about killing Wallace, it was about breaking him, and yet somehow he remained unbroken. The brutality of Wallace's execution was not confined to the scaffold. Even in death, his body was used as a symbol of English dominance, subjected to further humiliation that extended the spectacle beyond the execution itself. What followed after Wallace was severed from life was a chilling demonstration of English power, one that was both calculated and deliberate, designed to keep his legacy as a symbol of resistance from ever taking root in Scotland again. The executioner, having completed the gruesome task of disemboweling Wallace, moved on to sever his head. With one swift stroke, Wallace's head was removed from his body, but even in death, the humiliation did not end. The head, still dripping with blood, was displayed for the crowd to see, held aloft for all to witness. It was not just a grisly trophy, it was a statement. Edward I's message was clear. No one, not even the greatest of rebels, would escape the full wrath of the English crown. But the head was not merely displayed for a fleeting moment. The executioner dipped Wallace's severed head in tar to preserve it, and then mounted it on a spike on London Bridge, where it would remain as a public spectacle for years. The gruesome display of his head, still recognizable in its macabre form, would serve as a permanent reminder of the fate that awaited those who dared to defy the crown. It was a grotesque warning to anyone who might contemplate rebellion, a symbol of the fate that awaited anyone who sought to challenge Edward's authority. Wallace's body, now a dismembered corpse, was divided into 4 quarters. Each part of his body was sent to different cities in Scotland: Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, where they would be displayed as a stark reminder of what happens to those who resist English rule. The distribution of his body parts was calculated to inflict psychological terror on the Scottish population. By scattering Wallace's remains across the country, Edward was sending a message to every town, every village, and every person in Scotland. Wallace's rebellion was not merely crushed, it was obliterated in the most public and final way imaginable. The manner in which Wallace's body was desecrated was not just an act of revenge, it was a form of political communication. Edward I understood the power of symbols, and Wallace's dismembered body was meant to convey that the English crown's power was absolute and unchallengeable. The Scots were meant to see not just the body of a man who had once fought for their freedom, but the body of a broken symbol, rendered into pieces to be displayed as a grim reminder of the futility of resistance. But even in this horrific destruction, there was irony. Edward I had intended to make an example of Wallace, to erase him from history as a hero of Scottish independence. Instead, by subjecting Wallace to such a brutal, public execution, Edward had inadvertently ensured that Wallace's name would live on for centuries. The horrific nature of his death, the public display of his body parts, and the years his head remained on London Bridge, all of this ensured that Wallace's story would become a legend, a tale of defiance and sacrifice that would inspire generations to come. Wallace's brutal execution, though designed to destroy his spirit and crush Scottish resistance, had the opposite effect. Instead of extinguishing the fire of defiance, his death became the spark that rekindled it. The sheer horror of what Wallace endured, the public nature of his suffering, and the defiant silence with which he faced it all, transformed him from a military leader into a martyr, a symbol of the cost of freedom and the price of resistance. For the English, Wallace's death was meant to break the Scottish spirit, to ensure that no one would ever again dare to challenge their rule. But the brutal spectacle that had been intended to intimidate only galvanized the Scottish people. Wallace's suffering was no longer just a tale of personal tragedy. It became a call to action, a reminder that the price of liberty was worth paying, even if it meant enduring the same fate. The Scottish response to Wallace's execution was immediate and profound. Many of his former supporters, previously uncertain or disillusioned, now saw his death not as a defeat, but as the catalyst for something greater. The pain of his loss transformed into resolve. The brutality of the English crown, laid bare for all to see, exposed the true face of Edward I's regime. Wallace had shown Scotland that they were not merely subjects of a foreign king, but people with a right to fight for their freedom. Wallace's execution did not signal the end of Scottish resistance. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new chapter, one defined by even greater determination. Figures like Robert the Bruce, who would later become the King of Scotland, were reportedly moved to action by the spectacle of Wallace's execution. For Bruce and other Scottish leaders, the sight of Wallace's death solidified their resolve to continue the fight against the English. Wallace's martyrdom became a rallying cry for those who refused to accept English rule, a reminder that some causes were worth dying for and that freedom could not be taken without a fight. The very nature of Scottish resistance shifted after Wallace's death. The Scots, having witnessed the depths of English cruelty, understood that there would be no mercy for those who resisted. They knew that capture by the English would mean torture and humiliation beyond imagination. This knowledge led to a more desperate and resolute form of warfare. Scottish fighters would now prefer to die in battle rather than face the horrors of capture, knowing that surrender would bring nothing but further suffering. Wallace's death also left a psychological scar on the Scottish people. The horror of his execution, the public display of his mutilated body, became a collective trauma that united the Scots in ways that military victory alone could not. His martyrdom was a moral victory that inspired a renewed sense of national identity and determination. The brutality of Wallace's death was not the end of Scottish resistance. It was the catalyst for its resurgence, giving the Scots a shared cause that transcended personal revenge and united them in their fight for independence. The impact of Wallace's execution extended far beyond the borders of Scotland. His death shocked Europe, and the brutality of his punishment became a topic of international discussion. The methods of execution used by Edward I were widely condemned, and Wallace's suffering became a symbol not just of resistance, but of the cruelty that often accompanies the exercise of unchecked power. His execution had a profound effect on the way other European kingdoms viewed English rule, and it contributed to England's growing isolation on the international stage. Wallace's death, though a devastating blow to Scotland, ultimately became one of the defining moments of the Wars of Scottish independence. His sacrifice fueled the fire of rebellion, and his legacy, far from being extinguished, was woven into the very fabric of Scotland's struggle for freedom. The Scots now had a martyr, a hero whose memory would inspire them long after his body had been dismembered and displayed for all to see. William Wallace's execution, in all its brutality, achieved the opposite of what Edward I had intended. Instead of erasing Wallace from the Scottish memory, it cemented his place as a national hero and a symbol of resistance. In the years following his death, Wallace transformed from a rebel leader to a martyr. his name and legacy becoming the very embodiment of Scottish defiance against English oppression. The legend of Wallace's sacrifice began to take shape even before his body had been disposed of. His death was so gruesome, so public, that it transcended the immediate political context and became a story of suffering for a higher cause. Wallace's martyrdom was woven into the fabric of Scottish identity, not as a tale of failure, but as one of moral victory. He had fought not for personal power, but for the freedom of his people. His willingness to face unimaginable suffering without renouncing his cause became a powerful example of dedication to a principle that transcended life itself. In the years that followed, Wallace's story became part of the fabric of Scottish nationalism. His courage in the face of torture, his refusal to beg for mercy, and his enduring silence in the face of death all became key elements of his legend. Wallace's execution, which was meant to serve as a warning, was instead transformed into a source of inspiration. His death became a touchstone for all future resistance movements, not just in Scotland, but across Europe. The psychological impact of Wallace's martyrdom was profound. His execution not only united the Scottish people, but also gave them a symbol they could rally around. Wallace had become more than just a man. He had become an idea, a symbol of the Scottish will to resist oppression and fight for freedom, no matter the cost. The brutality of his death made it clear to the Scots that their struggle was not just against an invading army, but against a system of power that would stop at nothing to crush their identity and autonomy. Wallace's death was also a catalyst for the continuation of the Wars of Scottish Independence. His execution galvanized figures like Robert the Bruce, who would later lead Scotland to victory at Bannockburn and secure its independence. Wallace's sacrifice provided the moral foundation for the fight against the English, and the battle for Scotland's freedom became not just a political struggle, but a fight for justice, for the memory of Wallace, and for the future of the nation he had dreamed of. In the centuries that followed, Wallace's legacy would live on in literature, art, and folklore. His story became one of the most powerful symbols of resistance in history, inspiring countless individuals and movements. The ballads and stories of Wallace's life and death were passed down through generations, each retelling imbued with a sense of reverence for the man who had stood against tyranny, even at the cost of his life. Wallace's legacy also had a profound impact on the development of Scottish national identity. His name became synonymous with freedom and resistance, and the memory of his sacrifice was immortalized in the collective consciousness of the Scottish people. Even as Scotland moved towards eventual independence, Wallace's role as the first true martyr of the Scottish cause remains central to the national mythos. But Wallace's legacy extended beyond the borders of Scotland. His story became a rallying cry for oppressed peoples throughout Europe, a reminder that resistance against tyranny, no matter how seemingly hopeless, could inspire change. His death, while intended to be a warning, became a call to arms for anyone who believed in the right to self-determination and freedom. Though Edward further had hoped that Wallace's death would mark the end of Scottish resistance, the brutal execution instead marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where Wallace's spirit would live on in the hearts of those who fought for Scotland's freedom. The brutal execution of William Wallace did not only affect Scotland, it reverberated across Europe. News of Wallace's torture and death spread quickly, and the method of his execution, which shocked the conscience of the European world, became a symbol of the lengths to which Edward I would go to assert his dominance over Scotland. His punishment, meant to be an act of deterrence, instead cast a long shadow over England's reputation, both as a military power and as a kingdom capable of such cruelty. The manner in which Wallace was executed, the public humiliation, the disemboweling, and the subsequent display of his dismembered body sent shockwaves through Europe. In many places, the spectacle was seen as an example of tyranny, a stark reminder of what could happen when an unchecked monarch was allowed to wield absolute power. Wallace's execution became a point of contention, fueling anti-English sentiment in neighboring kingdoms and among those who felt that such excessive cruelty should never be allowed to happen again. The brutal nature of Wallace's death prompted condemnation from various quarters. Foreign dignitaries and diplomats from other European kingdoms were horrified by the reports of what had transpired in London. The idea of a man being tortured and publicly executed for defying a foreign ruler seemed not only barbaric but unnecessary. In fact, some monarchs began to question Edward's methods, wondering if his violent treatment of Wallace might lead to the destabilization of English rule in the broader European context. As the news of Wallace's death spread, it also began to shape the diplomatic relationships between England and its neighbors. Though England's reputation as a military powerhouse had long been feared, the execution of Wallace raised concerns about the ethical dimensions of English rule. The English monarchy's ruthless handling of its enemies became a topic of discussion in royal courts throughout Europe, particularly in regions where England's influence was beginning to spread. Simultaneously, the brutality of Wallace's execution spurred discussions about the laws of warfare and the treatment of prisoners. Across Europe, the execution of Wallace marked a turning point in the way that monarchs and governments began to think about the rights of their subjects and the methods used to suppress resistance. While the practice of execution was certainly not uncommon, the sheer public cruelty of Wallace's death forced many to reconsider the line between justice and brutality, and it spurred debates about what was acceptable in the fight for political dominance. In some places, the tale of Wallace's martyrdom stirred the desire for change. The memory of Wallace's gruesome death became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked royal power and a warning of what could happen to anyone who defied an absolute ruler. Wallace's execution led to a more widespread questioning of monarchical authority in the centuries that followed, and the idea that leaders should be held accountable for their actions gained traction, even in monarchies with long histories of autocracy. For Scotland, however, Wallace's death and its subsequent international repercussions were far from over. While Wallace's execution had momentarily crushed the Scottish rebellion, it had also fueled the fires of resistance. The Scots, now with a martyr at the heart of their cause, found renewed strength in the knowledge that Wallace's death had not been in vain. Wallace's story spread far beyond Scotland's borders, becoming a symbol of resistance against tyranny, not only for the Scots but for oppressed peoples everywhere. And so the ramifications of Wallace's death did not stop at the English border. His story was carried across Europe and beyond, growing into a symbol of defiance that continued to inspire those who stood against oppression. Though Edward IV had hoped to rid himself of a troublesome adversary, the brutal execution of William Wallace only ensured that the spirit of resistance would endure, and that the name of Wallace would continue to echo through the centuries. The savage and public nature of William Wallace's execution became a catalyst for the evolving ideas surrounding justice, punishment, and human dignity in medieval Europe. The brutality with which Wallace was executed shocked the collective conscience of Europe, and his treatment became a touchstone in discussions about the treatment of enemies, prisoners, and traitors. Though Wallace's death was meant to instill fear and maintain control, it inadvertently exposed the dark side of medieval judicial practices, pushing forward a nascent understanding of justice that would eventually contribute to the development of international law and human rights principles. Wallace's execution, the very method of which was designed to humiliate and break him, was viewed with disgust in many corners of Europe. The act of disemboweling him while still alive, publicly displaying his severed head, and dividing his body into quarters for display seemed too excessive. Even by the brutal standards of medieval punishment, it was an execution that went beyond legal retribution. It was about obliterating not just the person, but the very symbol of resistance he had become. In the years following his death, the excessive cruelty of Wallace's execution became a talking point in discussions about the rights of prisoners and the limits of state power. In courts across Europe, Wallace's suffering raised ethical questions about what constituted justice in the face of rebellion. The stark contrast between the dignity and the brutal treatment Wallace received exposed the flaws in the existing systems of justice. Was it right to subject a man to such horrors for challenging authority, even if he had defied a monarch? Wallace's execution became an example of the extremes of state power, where mercy, compassion, and proportionality were wholly absent. As the 14th century progressed, the memory of Wallace's martyrdom influenced the emerging ideas of justice and the rights of individuals. In later centuries, his execution would be cited as an example of the need for reforms to prevent such excesses from becoming standard practice. Legal scholars and philosophers began to grapple with the concepts of cruelty and inhumanity, questioning whether such barbaric executions could truly be justified under any circumstances. Wallace's execution also drew attention to the ways that monarchs and governments could manipulate the judicial system for political purposes. In the case of Wallace, the trial was nothing more than a farce, a legal ritual designed to give an air of legitimacy to what was essentially a political execution. This manipulation of the legal system for power and control came to be seen as a dangerous precedent, one that needed to be addressed in order to safeguard individual rights against the whims of powerful rulers. By the 17th century, as European nations began to codify laws and establish clearer legal frameworks, the excesses seen in Wallace's execution would inform the development of the modern legal systems we recognize today. The treatment of prisoners, the concept of mercy, and the necessity of proportional punishment all began to take shape in the wake of such examples of judicial cruelty. Even within the context of England's own legal system, Wallace's execution sparked future debates. It highlighted the potential for abuse and the need for reforms to ensure that punishments remain humane. Edward I's brutal treatment of Wallace eventually came to be regarded as an overstep by the English monarchy, contributing to a more cautious approach to the treatment of rebels and enemies in the centuries that followed. The horrors of Wallace's death lingered in the English consciousness, and though the monarchy continued to exert its dominance, the execution marked a turning point in how future leaders and lawmakers would approach the balance of power and justice. Wallace's death thus became a key historical moment that not only impacted Scottish independence, but also helped shape the future of European legal thought. His suffering, tragic as it was, ultimately played a role in the slow evolution of the concept that even enemies and traitors deserved humane treatment and due process, principles that would become central to later international human rights discussions. The execution of William Wallace left an indelible psychological scar on the Scottish people. one that would persist long after the events of that day. The brutal and public nature of his death not only had immediate political ramifications, but also had a profound effect on the national psyche of Scotland. Wallace's martyrdom became a collective trauma for the Scots, shaping their national identity and uniting them in ways that military victories alone could not. The psychological impact of Wallace's execution was multifaceted. On the one hand, it served as a brutal reminder of the extent to which Edward I was willing to go to suppress resistance. The sight of Wallace's dismembered body, his head mounted on London Bridge for all to see, shattered any illusion that the English king was a benevolent ruler. For the Scots, it was a chilling demonstration of the cruelty that awaited anyone who dared oppose English rule. This trauma created a deep sense of fear and anger, but it also ignited a sense of solidarity among the Scottish people. The memory of Wallace's execution was burned into the collective consciousness of the nation. It became a symbol of not just the tyranny of the English, but also of the nobility of sacrifice for a higher cause. For generations, the Scots would remember Wallace not as a failed rebel, but as a hero who gave everything for the dream of Scottish independence. His death, though intended to break the spirit of resistance, instead became a rallying cry for those who refused to accept English domination. The trauma of Wallace's death also served as a galvanizing force for future resistance. As the Scots faced new waves of English oppression, they could look to Wallace's sacrifice as proof that their struggle for freedom was justified, no matter the cost. Wallace's death had created a culture of defiance, where the people of Scotland would rather face death in battle than surrender to the English. It taught the Scots that, while they might be crushed physically, their spirit could never be fully broken. Even as Wallace's death cast a shadow over Scotland, it also planted the seeds for future Scottish victories. The psychological impact of his martyrdom became a source of strength for leaders like Robert the Bruce, who, inspired by Wallace's example, continued to fight for Scotland's independence. Bruce, who would eventually lead Scotland to victory at Bannockburn, is said to have been deeply moved by the spectacle of Wallace's execution, and it played a significant role in shaping his resolve. In the wake of Wallace's death, Scottish resistance took on a more desperate and determined form. Wallace had shown the Scots that the English would show no mercy, and this knowledge transformed the nature of the conflict. Scottish fighters, hardened by the memory of Wallace's fate, became even more resolute in their struggle. The war for independence was no longer just a political cause, it had become a moral one. Wallace's martyrdom gave the Scots the strength to endure even the most crushing defeats, knowing that they were fighting for something greater than themselves. The psychological trauma of Wallace's death, though painful, also united the Scots in a way that no military victory could. His execution created a shared memory of suffering that would bind the Scottish people together for centuries. The image of Wallace's defiant, silent face in the face of death would remain a symbol of resistance, inspiring future generations to continue the fight for freedom. In the long run, Wallace's death became a cornerstone of Scottish identity. The pain of his loss was channeled into a collective desire for freedom and justice. Wallace's execution, far from breaking the spirit of the Scottish people, ultimately strengthened it, transforming him into an enduring symbol of the struggle for liberty. Wallace's execution was more than just an act of physical brutality. It was a calculated political maneuver, a symbol of Edward III's ruthless approach to maintaining control over Scotland. For the English king, the goal was clear. Wallace had to be destroyed, not only as a man, but as a symbol of defiance. The method of execution was chosen for its symbolic weight. It was intended to send a message to both Scotland and to any other potential rebels across Europe. The spectacle of Wallace's death was a carefully crafted political performance designed to reinforce the English crown's absolute power. By choosing to display Wallace's head on a spike and dismember his body for public display, Edward I sought to make an example out of him. The message was simple: defy English rule, and this is the fate that awaits you. The dismemberment of Wallace's body was not just about execution, it was an act of erasure, a way of removing the symbol of resistance that Wallace had become. By dividing his body and sending the parts to different Scottish cities, Edward sought to ensure that the physical and symbolic impact of Wallace's death would spread across the land. Every part of his body was a reminder to the Scots of what would happen to anyone who dared challenge English authority. The public nature of the execution was equally significant. Medieval executions were often public affairs, but this one was designed to be a massive spectacle, an event that would be remembered for years to come. The crowds gathered not only to witness the death of a man, but to participate in a larger narrative being spun by Edward I and his court. The execution was not merely about justice. It was about sending a political message that would have far-reaching consequences for the Scottish people. For Edward, the execution was not just a punishment for Wallace. It was an assertion of his absolute authority. The act of turning Wallace's death into a public spectacle reinforced the idea that Edward was the unchallenged ruler of the British Isles. It was a message that was meant to crush any hope of Scottish resistance. But in doing so, Edward I created a powerful symbol. Wallace's death, designed to humiliate and destroy him, instead became a powerful emblem of defiance, one that would inspire future generations of Scots to resist English domination. The public humiliation of Wallace was meant to show the English people and the Scottish rebels that their king was untouchable, but it also served to isolate Scotland even further. Edward I's excessive cruelty in handling Wallace served to alienate Scotland from England, leaving the Scots with little hope of reconciliation. Rather than bringing the Scots to their knees, the execution only deepened their resolve to continue the fight for independence. The symbolic nature of Wallace's execution did not end with the immediate aftermath. Over the years, his death would become a key part of Scotland's national mythology. Wallace's fate would come to represent not just the struggle for freedom, but the noble sacrifice made for the greater good. His execution, which Edward intended to crush the rebellion, became the very thing that ensured it would live on in the hearts and minds of the Scottish people. Through Wallace's death, Edward I had created a martyr, and through his martyrdom, Wallace's legacy became a political symbol that outlived the brutal spectacle of his execution. The very cruelty that Edward I employed to suppress Wallace's legacy ensured its endurance. Wallace's execution, far from being the end of Scottish resistance, became the spark that ignited a deeper, more widespread fight for Scottish independence, one that would eventually lead to the downfall of Edward's own dynasty. While the immediate political consequences of Wallace's execution were clear, the long-term implications of his death would extend beyond Scotland and England. The brutal manner in which he was executed, publicly disemboweled and dismembered, and the widespread spectacle of his suffering would go on to shape the development of legal principles in Europe. Wallace's execution, horrific as it was, became a turning point in the evolution of international law. and the treatment of prisoners of war, traitors, and rebels. At the time, the method of execution chosen for Wallace, hanging, drawing, and quartering, was reserved for the most serious of criminals, particularly those accused of treason. However, it was also designed to be a theatrical display of the power of the state over the individual. For Edward III, Wallace's punishment was not simply about retribution. It was about sending a message that rebellion would not be tolerated under any circumstances. But it was this very brutality that set Wallace's death apart from other executions of the era and would come to symbolize the extremes of judicial cruelty. The public nature of Wallace's execution raised questions about the legitimacy of such extreme punishments. Across Europe, the spectacle of his suffering would contribute to growing discontent with the use of such public and inhumane methods of execution. For many, Wallace's death became a symbol of the dangers of absolute power and unchecked authority, and the cruelty of his punishment would eventually spark calls for legal reforms. By the late Middle Ages, many European monarchs and legal scholars began to advocate for more humane treatment of prisoners and criminals. While public executions were still common, the brutality of Wallace's execution was seen by many as a turning point in the conversation about the limits of state power and the rights of individuals. As concepts of justice and human dignity began to take hold in the 15th and 16th centuries, Wallace's execution would be cited as an example of how power could be abused and how punishment, when excessive, could undermine the very principles of justice it was meant to uphold. In England itself, the execution of Wallace began to be seen as an overstep. While the English monarchy continued to assert its power, the cruelty of Wallace's death led to discussions about the morality of such actions. By the time of the English Civil War, and later the development of more modern legal systems in Europe, the concept that even traitors and rebels should be treated with a basic level of human dignity had begun to take root. Wallace's execution, though serving as a brutal warning to Scotland, also became a cautionary tale for those in power about the dangers of excessive punishment. Wallace's execution would also influence the development of international law. The idea that rulers had a duty to treat even their enemies with basic humanity would become a foundational principle of the emerging field of international human rights. As European nations grappled with the concept of state sovereignty and individual rights, Wallace's brutal treatment served as a historical example of what could go wrong when power was wielded without regard for human dignity. Moreover, the public nature of Wallace's execution created a legal precedent for the treatment of rebels and traitors. It raised questions about the relationship between the sovereign and the subject, particularly in times of rebellion. The spectacle of Wallace's death prompted European monarchs and statesmen to reconsider how such figures should be treated and what message their punishment should send to their subjects and the wider world. The brutality of Wallace's execution ultimately played a key role in the development of legal protections for individuals, even those accused of the most heinous crimes. As the concept of human rights evolved, the memory of Wallace's suffering became a symbol of what should never be allowed again. The cruelty of his death was too extreme to be repeated without causing widespread moral outrage. In this way, Wallace's death became a pivotal moment in the history of justice, influencing the development of international law and the treatment of prisoners, traitors, and enemies. While the legal and political ramifications of Wallace's execution were significant, the most enduring impact was the cultural and emotional legacy it left on Scotland and beyond. Wallace's death, particularly the brutality of his execution, became a symbol of martyrdom sacrifice, and defiance in the face of overwhelming power. His execution transformed from a moment of defeat into a rallying cry for future generations who viewed his death not as the end of resistance, but as the fuel for a deeper, more enduring fight for freedom. The cultural memory of Wallace's execution was not just preserved in written accounts or legal frameworks, but deeply embedded in the collective Scottish consciousness. The emotional weight of his death was carried through generations, shaping the way the Scots would view themselves and their relationship with the English crown. Wallace's sacrifice became a defining moment in the national psyche, and as such it transcended the specifics of his life and death to become a symbol of Scottish identity and resilience. In the immediate aftermath of Wallace's execution, many Scots were left with a sense of profound loss. Wallace had not only been a leader in the military sense, but had come to embody the very spirit of Scottish resistance. His death at the hands of Edward I, in such a brutal and public fashion, only served to strengthen the resolve of those who continued to resist English rule. Rather than extinguishing the desire for independence, Wallace's martyrdom reignited the flame of rebellion, and his name became synonymous with freedom and the refusal to submit to tyranny. Artists, poets, and storytellers across Scotland began to immortalize Wallace's legend. Songs, poems, and ballads about his life and death spread throughout the land, often romanticizing his final moments. These stories depicted Wallace as a man who had sacrificed everything for his people, a hero who had not bowed to English power even in his final hours. The narrative of Wallace as a martyr for Scottish freedom took root, shaping how the Scots viewed their struggle for independence. The emotional impact of Wallace's death was also felt in the way the Scots understood the price of freedom. The trauma of his execution, the horror of watching a hero destroyed in such a public and brutal way, became a lesson about the true cost of resisting oppression. Wallace's death became a reminder that fighting for liberty often meant enduring unimaginable pain and sacrifice, and yet it was a cause worth pursuing. The Scots had witnessed Wallace's resilience in the face of death, and this act of defiance, though tragic, became a source of emotional strength. This emotional legacy was not confined to Scotland alone. Wallace's story spread across Europe and beyond, carried by the ballads and stories of his martyrdom. In other parts of Europe, his death became a symbol of resistance against tyranny and an inspiration for others who fought for their freedom. The universal themes of sacrifice, defiance, and the struggle for justice resonated with those living under oppressive regimes, making Wallace's story a powerful emotional and cultural force that transcended national boundaries. Even centuries later, Wallace's legacy continues to inspire. His execution, once seen as a moment of ultimate defeat, is now understood as the catalyst for a broader, more enduring struggle for justice. From the political rebellion of the Scottish Wars of Independence to the moral lessons of human dignity that followed, Wallace's death became more than a singular event in history. It became a powerful cultural symbol that transcended time. His story is still told in literature, film, and song as a testament to the power of the human spirit and the unyielding desire for freedom. In a way, the emotional legacy of Wallace's execution continues to shape how we understand resistance to power. It speaks to the timeless truth that some causes are worth suffering for, and that even in death, a person can become a symbol of hope, strength, and the enduring fight for justice. Wallace's story and the emotional resonance of his execution lives on as a reminder that the fight for freedom is never easy, but it is always worth pursuing. William Wallace's execution, though designed to erase his legacy, instead ensured its lasting impact. Over the centuries, Wallace transformed from a rebel leader to a powerful symbol of Scottish nationalism and resistance. His story, particularly the manner of his death, transcended the context of his time and became a foundational myth for the Scottish people, as well as for anyone who has ever fought against oppression. The brutality of his execution, meant to crush the spirit of Scotland, only solidified Wallace's place as a national hero, a martyr whose legacy would continue to inspire generations long after his death. From the moment his dismembered body was displayed across Scottish cities, Wallace became a symbol of martyrdom. His death, though tragic, injected new life into the Scottish resistance. It turned Wallace into more than just a man. It transformed him into an idea, a rallying cry for all those who sought to fight for freedom. His martyrdom united the Scottish people, fueling their determination to continue the struggle for independence. Every Scottish victory, no matter how small, became infused with the memory of Wallace's sacrifice. The Scots had a cause, one that was now deeply personal. Wallace's death became the heart of the struggle, the driving force that kept hope alive. As the years passed, Wallace's story was retold again and again, each retelling deepening his status as a hero. Ballads, songs, and poems were written in his honor, recounting his bravery, his sacrifice, and his unwavering commitment to Scottish independence. These stories carried the spirit of his martyrdom far beyond the borders of Scotland, inspiring not just the Scottish people, but anyone who felt oppressed and under the heel of a tyrant. Wallace's name became synonymous with courage, sacrifice, and the unyielding fight for liberty. Even centuries after his death, his legend grew, and his story was passed down through generations as a reminder of the price of freedom. Wallace's execution also shaped how future generations would view their own struggles. In the context of modern movements for justice, civil rights, and national independence, Wallace's story became a symbol of resistance against tyranny. The emotional weight of his sacrifice transcended the specifics of the Scottish cause. His fight for independence, despite the overwhelming odds, became a universal tale of human dignity. Wallace's final moments, filled with suffering yet devoid of begging for mercy, became emblematic of the indomitable human spirit. His death reminded those who fought for freedom that even in the face of immense cruelty, there is power in standing for what is right. Beyond its political and emotional impact, Wallace's memory became deeply embedded in the cultural identity of Scotland. He was no longer just a historical figure, but a central part of what it meant to be Scottish. His name was invoked in times of struggle, his image invoked in moments of pride. His life and death became a lens through which Scots viewed their history and their place in the world. His legend embodied the resilience and strength of the Scottish people, a people who had, time and again, resisted foreign domination. In the years following Wallace's death, Scottish leaders, particularly Robert the Bruce, would look to his example as they continued the fight for Scottish independence, culminating in the Battle of Bannockburn. Internationally, Wallace's legacy also became a part of the global conversation about freedom, oppression, and the rights of individuals. While his story was initially tied to Scottish independence, the themes of resistance against tyrannical rule were universal. Wallace became a symbol for oppressed people everywhere, reminding them that no matter the strength of their enemy, the power of their resolve and the purity of their cause could never be completely extinguished. From Europe to the Americas, his story became a beacon for those who stood against injustice and fought for the rights of the oppressed. The enduring fascination with Wallace's story is reflected in modern pop culture, with his life and execution frequently depicted in films, books, and other media. In the 1995 film Braveheart, his character was immortalized as a larger-than-life hero, though the film took liberties with historical details. Regardless, the film reinforced Wallace's status as a symbol of defiance against tyranny. His iconic line, "They may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom," continues to resonate with those who see his story as a representation of the ultimate sacrifice for the cause of freedom. As we reflect on Wallace's execution, it becomes clear that his death was not the end of his influence. It was, in fact, a pivotal moment that transcended his own lifetime and shaped the future of Scotland and the world. Wallace's spirit lived on in the hearts of the Scottish people, who continued to resist English rule until their eventual victory. His memory was passed down through generations, and his story remains a touchstone for anyone who believes in the power of freedom and justice. Wallace's execution serves as a reminder that the fight for freedom often comes at a great personal cost. But it is through sacrifice that true heroes are made. His legacy, immortalized in history and culture, proves that even in death, a person's impact can reverberate through the ages, inspiring those who fight for justice and human dignity. His execution, a moment of brutal political theater, ultimately became a powerful symbol of resistance, one that endures to this day.